We're going to give it just a couple moments here for folks to get in and join, and then we will get started with today's vendor risk management webinar. All right. Well, folks are still getting logged in here, but we'll go ahead and get this thing started. So I want to thank everyone for taking time today to attend Security Studio's Vendor Risk Management webinar. We're going to talk about vendor risk management and what you need to know. For those of you that participated in the first vendor risk management series, some of this will be a refresher for you. But we are going to go a little bit deeper into the policy specifics today. That was something that we had been asked about and had been requested. So we're going to move through the first bit of content a little bit quickly so that we have time to focus really on the policy specifics. Just some quick housekeeping. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature and submit those questions. I will do my best to respond to them as we go. And if I don't get to them, I'll try to leave some time here at the end for a formal Q&A, and then we will follow up with you directly if you have more detailed questions. So with that, why don't we get started? I'm Ryan Cloutier, president of Security Studio. I like to say that, half of my gray hair is from working in information security, and the other half is from raising a teenager. And so I've been doing this stuff for quite a while. Been in the business officially for over 15 years. I'm a virtual chief information security officer to a handful of organizations and school districts throughout the country. I'm also a certified information systems security professional, or CISSP. If you're into social media, you can follow me on Twitter at CloutierSec. Some information security stuff, some silly stuff. But a really great community of folks out there in the information security world on Twitter. So let's start off with, what is a vendor? This question is commonly asked, and a vendor really is any company, person, or consultant, agency that you work with that's providing you any type of service, consulting to your business. You're using their software to run your business. Salesforce comes to mind. Really anyone that you're doing business with. Now, pre-pandemic, I would have said something like your toilet paper vendor is a very low risk vendor. But the pandemic showed me that I was very wrong about that. And it turns out your toilet paper vendor is your highest risk vendor. I may throw a bad dad joke in here and there as we go. So I do apologize in advance. So some of the common questions that we hear from folks that are trying to manage their vendors is, who should be that first point of contact for any new potential vendor? And ideally, you want to have that person be as close to procurement as possible. We all get calls every day from folks looking to sell us products. We go out on the web, we look for products ourselves. When we start getting close to thinking we might make a decision, about that product, that's the time to really start working on our risk management for that vendor. And to that point, the second question is, when should vendors be assessed? As early as possible in the process. Doing a risk assessment on a vendor after you have a contract in place is generally a little bit too late. So you're going to want to try to get those risk assessments done as close to the front end of that relationship as possible. There's a lot of benefits to doing that. One of the benefits is that you potentially can use those risk findings to negotiate a better rate. Maybe that vendor has some work to do or some room to improve, and you can use that as leverage in your negotiations. It also lets you know if a vendor is going to be too high of a risk for your organization. So you want to assess them as early as possible. The best way to go about building internal stakeholder support for a vendor risk management program is really to have some conversations with those stakeholders. There's some interesting stats that you can share with them. One really great stat is that 89% of security breaches that have occurred in the last 4 years were the direct result of a third party. So not the company themselves having a data breach, but one of the products or services that they use to conduct their business has a data breach. Unfortunately, the name that you hear in the news most often is the company who was breached, not the company who was responsible for the breach occurring. So that's a great way to build that support. Also, insurability. Insurability for companies now is being called into question if they're not doing enough of the right things when it comes to managing risk, when it comes to having appropriate security controls in place. And this includes with your third-party vendors. Another question that we get a lot is what is an unacceptable risk? And the way I like to think about this is that an unacceptable risk is a risk that would cause your business to cease to function. So if that risk became a reality, that it would be so significantly disruptive that it would cause your business to be unable to function. The other unacceptable risk is any risk that poses a threat to human life, health, or safety. Those generally are unacceptable. But really, it's a personal decision that each business has to make for themselves when they're deciding, what will or will not be acceptable for us to take on as a risk. For me, it's again, health, life, and safety. It's any risk that potentially could be damaging to the brand or the business's operations. Another question is, who has the authority to replace vendors with unacceptable risk? And the answer there is, the highest person in the organization should have that authority, but ideally they should then have delegated that authority down to whoever is responsible for managing risk. So the organization has someone appointed to manage risk, and that person ideally should be empowered to call out vendors that have unacceptable risk and to be able to replace those vendors should that unacceptable risk go unmitigated. Are there exceptions to vendor risk management? Absolutely. There are always exceptions, and an exception process should be thoroughly documented. You should try to adhere to it as often as possible and go back and re-look at it. So any exception should be reviewed, ideally on a quarterly basis, but at least annually. There will always be exceptions, legacy products. There's a need for a vendor because of something unique they provide. There could be a lot of reasons for it, but just make sure that when you do make exceptions, they're documented, that they follow a proper exceptions process with approvals, and that those exceptions are reviewed on at least a annual basis. The way in which that you will deal with an exception really comes down to the nature of the exception itself. Why is it being made? How does it support the business? What is the worst case scenario if something goes wrong? And what are the most likely things to go wrong? That information will inform you on how best to deal with any exceptions. So, what is a vendor risk management policy? Really, what a vendor risk management policy is it's a way for you to control the third party fourth party, and ultimately N party risk. So we know that our third parties have third parties who have third parties. It's kind of like, for those of you on the call that are old enough, it's that old shampoo commercial, she tells two friends and she tells two friends and they tell two friends and so on and so forth. We're at a point now where I would say the majority of organizations out there are using a third party who is also reliant on multiple third parties, which is why it's really important to have an effective risk management policy for your vendors, because you might be dealing with a singular vendor, but in the ecosystem of that vendor, there are 20 other vendors behind them. So having very clear documentation and process on how and why and what will be managed and expected from that vendor is very important. An effective policy is going to simplify managing all this as well. So, what is a vendor risk management policy? We covered that. What is it not? Well, it's not just a document. It is, a set of guidelines. It really should be a living thing that your organization is leveraging to manage risk. It's not just words. It's not just for compliance, and it's not necessarily meant to be read by everyone. It's a reference document. A VRM policy is not a policy if it hasn't been approved by leadership and executive management. And in addition to approving it, they need to support it. A VRM policy is not a policy if it's going to hinder the business more than it protects it. We need to be effective. We need to have an appropriate level of control, but we also have to keep in mind that, our job as risk managers, as security people, as those that support the business, it is to support the business, to make sure the business is able to function and can continue to produce whatever that business produces. And if our efforts to protect it start to hinder the ability for the business to do business, we now are in a losing situation. A policy, VRM policy should not be static. It does need to be updated frequently, and it needs to adapt and change with the business needs and business risks. Now, S2 Vendor, which is the product that Security Studio produces to help you manage vendor risk, has a lot of good detail. Also, if you don't today have a vendor risk management policy, please go to our website. We have a template available for you. We're not going to collect a registration email, not going to blast you with marketing. You can go get it right now and use it as you see fit in your organization, and we won't bother you. Your policy, whether you choose to use our template or write your own or get somebody else's, should at least cover the following: the who's, the how's, and the when's of when you're entering a vendor into your vendor management system. Obviously, we like our system. It's very simplified, easy to use. But no matter what you're doing, whether you're tracking on an Excel spreadsheet, whether you're using our product or somebody else's product, your policy should be very clear on who, how, and when to enter that information into your vendor management system. Your policy should grant you the authority to enforce cooperation, both internally from stakeholders and those within the business, but also contractually with your vendors. I go back to something I said a little bit earlier. A lot of organizations that are doing vendor risk management well are able to leverage that what they know about their vendors' risk in their contracts. One important thing to make sure is always in a contract with a vendor is that what is the vendor's responsibility for providing you notice if they have a security incident or event. How much how much skin does the vendor have in the game with you when a security event happens? When will you be notified? These are all really important things. Your policy should also have instructions on what to do for exceptions. Your policy is going to help you to enforce accountability. It's going to, if it's done well, establish acceptable risk thresholds. It's also going to empower you with the authority to act on the results from your vendor assessment. Whenever we conduct a vendor assessment, there's always something to be found. And if you do assess a vendor, if you do assess a vendor and everything appears to be perfect, I would highly encourage you to verify that. In my experience doing this for many, many years, I have yet to meet any organization that's doing everything absolutely right all the time. So there is going to be some risk present, and you want to make sure that you understand that and that your policy supports having the authority to take action with what you discover. So we're going to go deep now into the weeds on the policy itself. We're going to take a look at an example policy. We'll talk through the specifics of that policy. If anyone has any questions on anything I've covered previously, again, just a quick reminder, use the Q&A function and submit them to me. So whenever we're beginning our journey with a vendor risk management policy, we want to start with the basics. We really do want to keep it simple and small, and focus on the most critical components first. The reason for this is if we make the policy too broad or try to include too much at once, it can be very difficult to get adoption. It can be very difficult to test that policy to make sure that it's actually functioning as designed and supporting the business and not hindering the business. So I always encourage everyone to start off small, focus on those most critical business assets first, those most critical vendors first, and then expand from there. So every policy should include a purpose, the audience, the definitions. So what are the terms that we're using within this policy document? The actual policy language itself. It should also define what is an assessment and what does that look like? What are the expectations? What is the management process that we're going to follow to ensure that we are assessing our vendors and that we are holding them accountable and we have those processes figured out? It should also have a section for any waivers or exceptions. And then lastly, how is this policy going to be enforced? What are the expectations and what are the consequences for failure to follow it? So with that, let's go ahead and dive in a little deeper. So looking at the purpose, all policies should open with what is the purpose of this policy? And these next few slides, some of them are pretty busy. I'm not going to read every word, but I want to talk through it at a high level with you. So in this example, the purpose of this policy is to make sure that the products and services that we're using to conduct our business are safe for us to use, or at least that we are aware of any risks that they could pose to us, whether those are inherent or residual risks. We want to take a look at that. And doing this is part of our overarching due care and due diligence that's required of us. If we're working in any kind of regulated industry, you're very familiar with that. If you are not in a regulated industry, your insurance company is going to be very concerned now going forward how you are doing due care and due diligence. A lot of the insurance renewals that I've seen used to come with a 3-page questionnaire, now come with a 13 to 30-page questionnaire. And one of those big question areas is how are you managing your third-party risk? So the purpose should outline, what is this policy? What do we intend to do with this policy? And as you can see here, it is really to contain the requirements for how we are going to conduct third-party information security due diligence. Now, all policies should also have a call out to the audience. So in this case, the policy is applying to any individual that is interacting with a third party on behalf of the organization. So if they are negotiating contracts, if they're responsible for selecting and bringing these vendors into the company, this policy absolutely applies to them. And it can also apply to individuals that are interacting with that third party at a higher level. So for example, buildings and grounds folks, our maintenance staff, a lot of times will work very closely with third-party vendors that are perhaps providing products or services, machines, boilers, door control systems, things like that. And when that individual is interacting with them on a very close level, this policy would also then encompass and apply to them. We want to go into some definitions. So it's very important if we're going to use a term in a policy that we have a definition section where we explain what that term means. So here it's employee, We define what is a third party. We define what are information resources. We define inherent information security risk. And then we define residual information security risk. Now, just as a point of clarity, inherent risk goes by another name, which is impact. And really it's saying, how important is this vendor to me? And if something was to happen to that vendor, what is the impact that I'm going to experience? And as a lot of us saw in the last week or two, there was a third-party company that had their software compromised, which then in turn led to hundreds and hundreds of companies being impacted by ransomware. So that particular vendor was a high impact vendor. So there may be additional due diligence that we want to apply when dealing with a high impact vendor. Residual information security risk is what's left over. There is no such thing as risk elimination. There will always be risk present, and the risk that's left over after we've done everything reasonable and practical to limit it is what we refer to as residual risk. And there will always be some, so we just need to call it out and account for it. Now, the policy itself is going to be the main body of the document. So this is policy language. This is where we're going to get very granular in setting those expectations and in referring to those definitions that we just saw. So this particular policy is organized into 3 sections: general, physical, and technical. And this is, according to the precaution or the requirement specified. So we go ahead and explain assessments. What are the assessments that are needed? So every third-party granted access to information resources has to sign an NDA. That's what this policy says. Got to have an NDA in place if you're going to have access to sensitive data. Third-party relationship needs to be evaluated for inherent information security risk prior to interacting with the organization. So in this policy example, we're taking a position that says before we get too far into a business relationship with a vendor, we need to take a look at what their risk is. How you would apply this to a legacy vendor is a little bit different than how you would apply it to a new vendor. But really, the best practice is to do your risk assessments long before you get into a business relationship. You want to make sure that you have criteria for how you're going to classify what is high, medium, and low risk to your organization. And then you want to, again, review this stuff at least biannually. So, you want to, anytime really that the vendor makes a major change to their product or service, you probably want to do a new assessment. You want to reassess them. So they push out a brand new version of software. Maybe they've just rolled out some really new fancy service for you, or have gained new access to sensitive systems they previously didn't have access to. That would be a great time to reassess them. So having that type of information called out in your policy can be quite helpful. Continuing through the assessments, third-party relationships that are identified as high or medium have to be evaluated using questionnaires, publicly available information, and technical tools. So really want to do a very robust assessment on them if they are classified as a high or medium risk to the business. You want to be able to also look at the residual risk, and you have to account for administrative, physical, and technical controls. Now, your specific policy language might look different, but this is best practice policy language. So you can always dial it up and down depending on your specific risk, but ideally you want to account for all of those areas. Your third-party relationships that do not meet an established residual risk threshold have to be terminated. If you're posing too much of a risk to my business that it's now dangerous for me to do business with you, we probably want to end that relationship. You're going to want to make sure there's some kind of formal management approval and waiver process. And then you're going to want to have some type of change management as well, so that when those significant changes occur and your risk threshold changes, you're able to evaluate that and then make an appropriate determination. If there are any relationships that are tied to a regulatory requirement, then you need to review those relationships at least annually as part of your due care and diligence. So once you've covered the assessment piece, now it's how are you going to manage this, and what are the agreements and contracts? What are the specifics that we're going to require? So in the policy itself, we call out those specifics. This makes it easy for anyone that maybe is new to the organization or is renegotiating a contract. Since we've implemented this policy, they can then refer to this and see, I need to have line items in the contract that are going to clearly call out how the vendor is going to have access to the organization, how the vendor is going to protect that information. How are we doing information transference? So what are the technical methods that we use for that, and the security controls around them? How are we going to break up? The divorce clause is so important. How are we going to get our data back? How are we going to be ensured? How are we going to be assured that that data has been destroyed in a manner that is consistent with what we need for the information classification level? So highly sensitive information needs to be destroyed more aggressively than publicly available information. What are the minimum information security requirements that we have of this vendor, and making sure that that is present in the contract? And then the right for the organization to conduct audits and third-party information security protections and controls. Continuing on into management, if the third party contracts the information, if the third party is subcontracting anything, we need to call out any subcontracting relationships as well. So it's very important that we are detailed here about how we're going to manage the vendor and our relationship with the vendor. So this includes our service level agreements. This includes how long am I going to wait to be notified? What are you obliged to do when you notify me? How involved is the vendor going to be in any security investigations that we might need to conduct? Are we able to log? It's very important to log their activities. In my experience, a lot of vendors will ask for access that they don't necessarily need. They ask for it because it's convenient, but not because it is required. I'll use a quick example here. I was working with a client, and they worked with a buildings and control company who wanted all the time access to their boiler monitor. So they had a boiler in place. This company wanted to be able to monitor the boiler 24/7, 365, and to be able to log in and do maintenance. When we really talked through it, what we found out is they actually only needed to access it once a month for 10 minutes. We were actually able to reduce that client's risk profile significantly by working with the vendor to say, you don't actually need all the time access. Let's limit it to this maintenance window, which then allowed us to narrow the available attack surface. And then that obviously increased their security and reduced their risk. So making sure that all those activities are logged, we can see what's going on. I go back to that stat I mentioned earlier. 89% of security breaches, the direct result of a third party. If you have appropriate logging in place, a lot of times you'll catch these things. For example, the current thing going on with the REvil ransomware group, had those organizations been monitoring for a change in configuration and logging that change in configuration from their third-party vendor, they would have known immediately when that happened and could have taken corrective action that most likely would have prevented them from having a catastrophic ransomware event. So make sure you're logging your third party's activities. Continuing on along the management track, and this is, the larger part of the policy language, because again, it's informing us on how we're going to manage this third party and our relationship. So making sure we have terms in there about not divulging, certain information, not allowing the third party to use any information acquired as part of our relationship for their own purposes. Don't be selling my data to marketing, things like that. That they need to report all security incidents directly to your organization. That they provide you points of contact. This is important. Who do I call on your end if I see something funny? They need to provide you a list of personnel that are working on the contract. They need to provide you notification of any staff changes within 24 hours. Disgruntled employees are still a thing. So we need to know, hey, you just fired your top IT guy. He might or she might try to retaliate. So we need to know that stuff because it changes our risk profile. If anyone leaves the organization for any reason, we need assurances that any sensitive data they had will be recovered and returned. So be very detailed here. It's really important to call out all the ins and outs of that relationship. Now, back to the divorce clause, really important here. How are we breaking up? What is that process? How do I get the data back? How do we do these things? I encourage you to, include language here, like reminding them upon breakup that they're still beholden to any NDAs or confidentiality agreements that you've signed with them. Give them that friendly reminder. Make sure that the third party has contractually committed to surrender all information, access badges, cards, equipment, supplies, whatever that is that they have of yours, you need to be able to get back right away. Any equipment or supplies that's going to be retained by the third party needs to be documented and authorized by the organization. Waivers, again, exceptions happen. So we want to have waivers in place anytime that we deviate from the policy. So if we're going to make an exception, do something special or do something different than we would normally do per the policy, we want to make sure that we have the waivers in place. And without those waivers, there are no exceptions to any provision in the policy unless a waiver has been granted by the appropriate authority in the business. Lastly, we're going to talk through, enforcement. Like, this is really important in the policy. How do I hold everyone accountable to what this policy says we should be doing, whether that's our internal staff, whether that's the third-party vendor themselves. So we want to make sure that we're very clear on how we're going to enforce this, and that this particular policy is not going to supersede any other policy, and those policies don't necessarily supersede this one. If there are any perceived or unintended conflicts within the policies, they need to be brought up so that we can address them. Sometimes, different groups will write different policies and, surprisingly enough, not talk to each other. And so those policies sometimes can be in conflict. So we need to work through that. We need to make sure that our policies are supportive of each other and not in conflict. And if we do find any conflicts, we need to remediate that very quickly. Any personnel that is found to have violated this policy could, have their access rights removed. They could be terminated. If a third party is violating it, it could, potentially result in a breach of contract or termination of contract. And if any significant lines get crossed, there potentially are civil or criminal penalties that can be enforced. So as I promised, we do have on our website a policy template for you. You can get that here at this link. It's a great policy. It's the one you just looked at. Very detailed. It's a fantastic starting point. It has covered all the basics and is very detailed. You can add to it. You can remove from it. I would encourage you to be very careful if you're going to take things out of it, but definitely feel free to use it, take it, and make it your own. We also have a vendor risk management assessment. That's our S2 vendor product. That is really a very simplified way for you to get a crystal clear picture on what your third-party risk is, what steps need to be taken, and it's a really simplified way to manage that risk. We also around here believe in mission before money, and we want to help everyone get better at keeping themselves safe from cyber criminals. So what we've done is put together the S2Me. This is a free personal risk assessment. This is something that we make available to everyone. You can find it at s2me.io. It is based on our commercial tool, but it focuses on those at-home behaviors. So this is great. A lot of IT people say, oh, I don't need this. I already know all this security awareness stuff. Fantastic. Your parents, your children, your neighbors, those who are around you, your coworkers, we're all using the same internet. And unfortunately, a lot of us are drunk driving in the wrong direction on the information superhighway. So the S2Me helps us to learn what are those good behaviors we need at home. It'll provide a roadmap for improvement. It is truly free. We're not going to blast you with marketing emails or anything like that. We even have a link to 10-minute email. Should you want to sign up with a burner email? We're not interested in your data. We're interested in helping you and those that you care about to keep yourself safe from cyber criminals. We also have a feature in here where we provide free threat monitoring as well, if that's something you're interested in. So wanted to bring that up for you. As promised, I wanted to leave a fair amount of time for Q&A today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to everyone for questions. So while I wait on this, see if anybody's got any questions for me. One common question I get a lot is, what do I do if a vendor refuses to provide me a risk assessment? What do I do if the vendor provides me a risk assessment that's inadequate? How do I handle that situation? And the reality is if a vendor is not willing to provide you some type of attestation, whether that's answering your risk assessment, whether that's sending you the results of one that they've conducted, providing you, for example, a SOC 2 report or something like that, if they're not willing to do that, for me, that really calls into question how willing they're going to be there for me as their customer. If they can't help me on the basics of making sure that we're managing risk together, are they going to be there when the product doesn't work? Are they going to let me know when something bad has happened? It's just important. So when a vendor refuses, it's usually a red flag for me. Now, having said that, Microsoft's going to point you to the trust center. Google's going to send you, to their trust center. Those very large vendors are going to say, look, we've already covered this. Here's the link to the website. But with your smaller vendors, it's really important. And if they don't know why it's important, give them a copy of this webinar, talk them through it. The reality is if my business goes under because of something my vendor did, I'm the one that pays that price. I'm the one that hurts my customers. I'm the one that has to pay all those fees. So I want vendors that are in relationships with me where we have a mutually beneficial arrangement and they have some skin in the game. One of the questions that just came in is, what are the minimum information security clauses that should be included in an agreement? I would say notification, very important. When are you going to tell me? I would like to know and see that they have a patch management program in place, that they are doing asset management, that they have implemented multi-factor authentication, that they have off-site, offline backups, and that they do security awareness training with their employees. That is the bare bones basics for everybody. And if more of us did that today, if more of us had just those bare bone basics in place, we would all be about 60% less likely to be affected by ransomware. It's just amazing, or I shouldn't say less likely to be affected, less likely to be down for more than a whole day. If you've got good backups, you can get back up on your feet. If you've got multi-factor, you can catch when somebody's trying to compromise an account because you're getting that multi-factor alert and you're going, hey, wait a second, this isn't me. So the same things that I would tell you to do for yourself, I would say are minimum requirements in a contract with a vendor. We will put up on our website the copy of this presentation as well as the recorded webinar that we did today. So for anyone that wasn't able to attend, would like to watch it again, share it with friends or colleagues, we will have that available probably by end of day today. If not, tomorrow morning it'll go up. Any other questions from the group? Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. Lastly, just to pitch you something because they like when I do that. So the Security Studio platform really is a way to simplify how you're managing risk, whether that's internally within your organization, whether that's externally with your vendor or your employees, right? What we've done is we've created a very simplified method for managing your information security risk And we help you to put that risk into context by using a really simplified scoring model called the S2 score. It goes from 300 to 850. It's like a credit score. What's really nice about it is that most of us are interacting with non-technical people when we're trying to get our funding, when we're trying to explain why we need culture change or why we need to maybe renegotiate contracts with vendors. A lot of times the folks that we have to convince are not technical people. So we've accounted for that in the Security Studio platform by creating this very easy to consume executive report that allows them to see where they are from a risk perspective using a scoring method that they're familiar with, show them how they compare to their peers, and what are the steps and actions that need to happen in order to reduce risk and increase security. All the way at the bottom, we've got the most detailed action item reports that will satisfy even the most hardcore security people with complete descriptions and recommendations for actions to take. I had another question come in. Vendor due diligence. So ideally, you should be doing vendor due diligence at a minimum annually. And then also, anytime there's a significant change in the relationship with the vendor or a significant change in the product or service offering from the vendor. So for example, there's a piece of software that we use that has a significant update coming. There are new capabilities, new modules, all this new stuff. Well, I don't know if that new stuff poses new risks. So because of that, we need to reassess that particular product and that vendor. The other time that you're going to want to do that is if the vendor has had any type of merger or acquisition. So, a vendor's risk profile changes dramatically when they start adding new companies into the fold. And if any of you on this call have been through a merger or acquisition before, you know how messy it can be. There's that quasi period of both companies trying to kind of run simultaneously, and they're setting up some file shares, and some weird stuff can happen. So if a company is going through a merger or acquisition, I would encourage you to reassess that vendor because their risk profile most certainly has changed significantly. Lastly, here's how you can get a hold of us. This is contact info. I do encourage you to check out our website. We do have a lot of great free resources. And again, not going to collect a marketing email from you. We believe in mission before money. We're here to serve and we're here to help. And that really is the core of who we are as an organization and who we are as the human beings behind this organization. So if you ever have any questions, and it doesn't even have to be business related, right? If you've got security questions, you're maybe struggling with, how do I secure my home router? How do I get my mom or dad to quit falling for Facebook scams? Whatever that might be, don't hesitate to reach out and, ask us. We'll if we don't have the answers, we're going to find somebody for you who does and point you in that right direction. So I really appreciate everyone taking time today to attend this. Hopefully it was very helpful for you and you learned something. Feel free to reach out to me if you have additional follow-up questions. And then just as a recap, we will publish this out on our website either later today or tomorrow, and we will have the deck available as well. One last question here. Is a SOC 2 Type 2 report considered part of vendor due diligence? Yes, it is very much part of vendor due diligence. It will not account for all things, but it is helpful. Generally speaking, if a vendor can provide me a SOC 2 Type 2 attestation, that will satisfy a lot of the questions that I have. And then I can focus on the questions that a SOC 2 Type 2 doesn't cover, such as, when are you going to notify me of a security breach? Whose insurance is going to pay for the investigation? When are we going to notify customers? And who's going to be responsible for that? So those types of questions are very relevant to managing your vendor risk, but aren't necessarily going to be part of a SOC 2 Type 2. And with that, I thank everyone for attending today. It's been my pleasure to present this to you, and hopefully you will now be able to manage your vendors more effectively. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.